The vicar's garden at Stoneground has been enclosed for more than 7 centuries, and during the whole of that time, its almost sacred privacy has been regarded as permanent and unchangeable. On the western boundary, the garden slopes down to a sluggish stream, hardly a stream at all, locally known as the Lode. The Lode bounds the garden on the west along its whole length, and there the moorhen builds her nest, and the kingfisher is sometimes, but in these days too rarely, seen. But the centre of vision, as it were, of this western edge lies in a cluster of tall elms. Towards these, all the garden paths converge, and about their base is raised a bank of earth upon which is heaped a rockery of large stones lately overgrown with furze. Now, Mr. Batchel's somewhat prim tastes in gardening had long resented this disorderly bank. In more than one place in his garden had wild confusion given place to a park-like trimness, and there were not a few who would say that the change was not for the better. Mr. Batchel, however, went his own way, and in due time he determined that he would remove the rockery. He was puzzled by its presence. He could see no reason why a bank should have been raised about the feet of the elms and surmounted with stones. Not a ray of sunshine ever found its way there, and none but coarse and uninteresting plants had established themselves. Whoever had raised the bank had done it ignorantly, or with some purpose not easy for Mr. Batchel to conjecture. Upon a certain day, therefore, in the early part of December, when the garden had been made comfortable for its winter rest, he began, with the assistance of the gardener, to remove the stones into another place. Now, I do but speak there according to custom, and there'll be few of you who do not suspect the truth, which is that the gardener began to remove the stones while Mr. Batchel stood by and delivered criticisms of very uncertain value. Such strength, in fact, as Mr. Batchel possessed, had concentrated itself upon his mind and somewhat neglected his body. And what he called help during his presence in the garden was called by another name when the gardener and his boy were left to themselves with full freedom of speech. There were, in fact, few of the stones rolled down by the gardener that Mr. Batchel could even have moved. But his astonishment at their size soon gave place to excitement at their appearance. His antiquarian taste was strong and was soon busily engaged, because as the stones rolled down, his eyes were feasted in rapid succession by capitals of columns, fragments of moulded arches, mullions, and other relics of ecclesiastical building. Repeatedly did he call the gardener down from his work to put these fragments together. And before long, there were several complete lengths of arcading laid on the path. Stones which had perhaps been separated for centuries once more came together. And Mr. Batchel, rubbing his hands in extreme satisfaction, declared that he might recover the best part of a church by the time the rockery had been demolished. The interest of the gardener in such matters was of a milder kind. "We must go careful," he merely observed, "when we come to the organ." Well, they went on, removing more and more stones, until at length the whole bank was laid bare and Mr. Batchel's chief purpose achieved. How the stones were carefully arranged and set up in other parts of the garden is well known, of course, and need not concern us now. One detail, however, must not be omitted. A large and stout stake of yew, evidently of considerable age, but nevertheless quite sound, stood exposed after the clearing of the bank. There was no obvious reason for its presence, but it had been well driven in, so well that the strength of the gardener, or, if it made any difference, of the gardener and Mr. Batchel together, failed to even shake it. It wasn't unsightly, and it might have remained where it was, had not the gardener suddenly exclaimed, "This is the very thing we want for the pump." Well, indeed, it was so obviously the very thing that its removal was there and then decided upon. Now, the pump referred to a small iron pump used to draw water from the lode. It had been affixed to many posts in turn and defied them all to hold to it. No, not that the pump itself was at fault. I mean, it was a trifling affair enough. But the pumpers, you see, were usually garden boys whose impatient energy had never failed before many days to wriggle the pump away from its supports. When the gardener had, upon one occasion, spent half a day in attaching it firmly to a post, they had at once shaken out that post. Since, therefore, the matter was causing daily inconvenience, and the gardener becoming daily more concerned for his reputation as a rough carpenter, it was natural for him to explain, that is the very thing. And it was a better stake than any he'd used before, and as had just been made evident, a stake that the ground would hold. Yes, said Mr. Batchel. Now, it is the very thing, but can we get it up? Now, the gardener always accepted that kind of inquiry as a challenge and replied only by taking up a pick and setting to work. After a few minutes, however, Mr. Batchel darted forward and laid his hand upon the pick. Hey, isn't that copper? He said. Now, every man who digs knows what a hiding place there is in the earth, and that the monotony of spade work is always relieved by a hope of turning up something unexpected. Treasure, of course, lies dimly behind all these hopes, so that the gardener, having seen Mr. Batchel excited over so much that was precious from his own point of view, was quite ready to look for something of value to an ordinary reasonable man. There, a copper might lead to silver, and that might in turn lead to gold. At Mr. Batchel's eager question, therefore, he peered into the hole that he'd made and examined everything there that might suggest the rounded form of a coin. He soon saw what had arrested Mr. Batchel. There was a lustrous scratch on the side of the stake, evidently made by the pick, and though the metal was copper, plainly enough, the gardener felt that he'd been deceived. I mean, copper of that sort gave no sort of excitement to him, and only the most feeble of interest. Mr. Batchel, however, was now on his hands and knees. And yes, now he discovered that there was a small, irregular plate of copper nailed to the stake. I mean, without any difficulty, he tore this away from the nails and soon scraped it clean with a shaving of the wood, and then rising to his feet, he examined his find. There was an inscription on it, so legible as to need no deciphering. I mean, it had been roughly and effectually made with a hammer and a nail, the letters being formed by a series of holes punched deeply into the metal. And what it said was, "Move not this stake, November the 1st, 1702. Well, to move the stake, however, was what Mr. Batchel had determined upon, and the metal plate he held in his hand interested him chiefly as showing how long the post had been there. I mean, he had happened, as he supposed, upon an ancient landmark. I mean, the discovery, recorded elsewhere, of a well near to the edge of his present lawn had shown him that his premises had once been quite differently arranged, and one of the minor antiquarian tasks that he'd set himself was to discover and record the old arrangement. I mean, he felt that the position of the stake would help him in this. I mean, he felt no doubt of it being a point upon the western limit of the garden, and not improbably marked in this way to show where the garden began and where ended the ancient hauling way, which had been secured to the public for purposes of navigation. The gardener, meanwhile, was proceeding with his work. With no small difficulty, he removed the rubble and the clay, which accounted for the firmness of the stake. It grew dark as the day went on, and the distant clock struck 5 before it was completed. Now, 5 was the hour at which the gardener usually went home. But he was not a man to leave a small job unfinished, and so he went on loosening the earth with his pick and trying the effect it influence upon the firmness of the stake. It gradually began to give, and it could be moved now a few inches from side to side. He lifted out the loosened stones and loosened more, and then his pick struck iron, which, after loosening, proved to be the links of a rusted chain. "Yeah, they've buried a lot of rubbish down here," he remarked, as he went on loosening the chain, which in the growing darkness could hardly be seen. Mr. Batchel, meanwhile, occupied himself in the simpler task of working the stake to and fro by loosening its hold, and ultimately it began to move with greater freedom. The gardener laid down his tool and grasped the stake which his master was holding, and their combined effort succeeded at once. The stake was lifted out. It turned out to be furnished with an unusually long and sharp point, which explained the firmness of its hold upon the ground. The gardener carried it to the neighbourhood of the pump in readiness for its next purpose, and made ready to go home. He would drive the stake tomorrow, he said, in the new place, and make the pump so secure that no boy could ever shake it. He also spoke of some designs that he had upon the chain, should it prove to be of any considerable length. Now, he was an ingenious man, the gardener, and his skill in converting discarded articles to new uses was rather embarrassing to his master. I mean, Mr. Batchel, as I've said, was a prim gardener, and he had no liking for makeshift devices. I mean, he had that day seen his runner beans trained upon a length of old gas piping, and he had no intention of leaving the gardener in possession of such a treasure as a rusty chain. What he said, however, and said with truth, was that he wanted the chain for himself. I mean, he in fact had no practical use for it, and he hardly expected it to yield him any interest. But a chain buried in 1702 must be examined. You know, nothing ancient comes amiss to a man of antiquarian tastes. Now, Mr. Batchel had noticed, whilst the gardener had been carrying away the stake, that the chain lay very loosely in the earth. The pick had worked well around it. He said, therefore, that the chain must be lifted out and brought to him tomorrow, bade the gardener good night, and he went into his fireside. Now, all that you've heard so far may sound like a record of the merest trifles, but please accept now this reminder: there's no such thing as a trifle. And what appears to be trivial has that appearance only so long as it stands alone. Regarded in the light of their consequences, these matters which seem to be least in importance turn out often enough to be the greatest. And these trifling occupations, as we may call them for the last time, of Mr. Batchel and the gardener, had consequences, which I will now tell you about, just as Mr. Batchel narrated them to me. But we will take the events in order. At present, Mr. Batchel is at his fireside, and his gardener is at home with his family. The stake is removed, and the hole, in which lies some sort of iron chain, is exposed. Now, upon this particular evening, Mr. Batchel was dining out. He was a good-natured man with certain mild powers of entertainment, and his presence as an occasional guest was not unacceptable at some of the more considerable houses of the neighbourhood. And I hasten to observe here that he was not a guest who ever made any great impression upon the larders or the cellars of his hosts. I mean, he liked port, but he liked it only of good quality and in small quantity. When, therefore, he returned from a dinner party, he was never either in a surfeited condition of body or in any confusion of mind. And in fact, not uncommonly, after his return on such occasions, did he perform accurate work. Unfinished contributions to sundry local journals were seldom absent from his desk. They were his means of recreation. They awaited convenient intervals of leisure, and Mr. Batchel was accustomed to say that of these intervals he found none so productive as a late hour or two after a dinner party. Upon the evening in question, he returned about an hour before midnight from dining at the house of a retired officer residing in the neighbourhood. An evening had been somewhat less enjoyable than usual. He had taken into dinner a young lady who had too persistently assailed him with antiquarian questions. I mean, Mr. Batchel did not like talking what he regarded as shop, and he was not much at home with young ladies, to whom he knew that in the nature of things he could be but imperfectly acceptable. I mean, with infinite goodwill towards them and a genuine liking for their presence, he felt that he had but little to offer them in exchange, that there was so little in common between his life and theirs. And he felt distinctly at his worst when he found himself treated as a mere scrapbook of information. I mean, it made him seem, as he would express it, dehumanized. Upon this particular evening, the young lady allotted to him, perhaps at her own request, had made a scrapbook of him, and he had returned home somewhat discontented, if also somewhat amused. I mean, his discontent arose from his having been deprived of the general conversation that he so greatly but so rarely enjoyed. His amusement was caused by the incongruity between a very light-hearted young lady and the subject upon which she had made him talk, because she had talked of nothing else but modes of burial. He began to recall the conversation as he lit his pipe and dropped into his armchair. She'd either been reflecting deeply upon the matter, or, as seemed to Mr. Batchel more probable, had read something and half forgotten it. He recalled her questions and the answers which he'd vainly tried to use to lead her to a more attractive topic. For example, will you tell me why people were buried at crossroads? He, well, consecrated ground was so jealously guarded that a criminal would be held to have forfeited the right to be buried among Christian folk. His friends, therefore, chose crossroads where there was set a wayside cross and make his grave at the foot of that. In some of my journeys in Scotland, I have seen... No. She would have no truck with Scotland. She stuck to her subject. But why have coffins come back into use? There is nothing in our burial service about a coffin. No, true. And well, I think the use of the coffin is due in part to an ignorant notion of confining the corpse, lest, like Hamlet's father, he should walk the earth. You'll have noticed that the corpse is always carried out of the house feet foremost to suggest a final exit, and the grave is often covered with a heavy slab. Very curious epitaphs are to be found on some of these slabs. Oh, no. But she was not to be drawn into the subject of epitaphs. She had made him tell her of other devices for confining spirits to their prison and of securing the peace of the living, especially of those adopted in the case of violent and mischievous men. So, altogether, a very unusual young lady. The conversation had, however, revived his memories of what was, after all, a matter of some interest, and he determined to look through his parish registers for records of exceptional burials. He was surprised at himself for never having done it before. But he dismissed the matter from his mind for the time being, and as it was a bright moonlit night, he thought he'd finish his pipe in the garden. Midnight was close at hand, but he strolled complacently around the garden, enjoying the light of the moon no less than in the daytime he would have enjoyed the sun. And thus it was that he arrived at the scene of his labours upon the Rockery. There was more light there than there had been at the end of the afternoon, and when he'd walked up the bank and stood over the hole that had been dug, he could distinctly see the few exposed links of the iron chain. Should he remove it now to a place of safety, out of the way of the gardener? It was about time for bed. The city clocks were then, in fact, striking midnight. Well, he'd let the chain decide. If it came out easily, he would remove it. Otherwise, it could remain until the morning. Well, the chain came out more than easily. It seemed to have a kind of force within itself. He gave but a slight tug at the free end with a view of ascertaining what resistance he had to encounter, and he immediately found himself on his back with the chain in his hand. Now, his back had fortunately turned towards an elm 3 feet away, which broke his fall, but that had been violent enough to cause him no little surprise. The effort that he'd made was so slight that he couldn't account for having lost his feet. And being a careful man, he was a little anxious about his evening coat, which he was still wearing. The chain, however, was in his hand now, and he made haste to coil it into a portable shape and return it to the house. Now, some 50 yards from the spot was the northern boundary of the garden, a long wall with a narrow lane beyond. It was not unusual, even at this hour of night, to hear footsteps there. Now, the lane was used, you see, by railwaymen who passed to and fro from their work at all hours, and also by some who returned late from entertainments in the neighbouring city. But Mr. Batchel, as he turned back to the house with the chain over his arm, heard more than footsteps. He heard, for a few moments, the unmistakable sound of a scuffle, and then a piercing cry, loud and sharp, and then a noise of running. I mean, it was such a cry as could only have come from one in urgent need of help. Well, Mr. Batchel dropped his chain. Now, the garden wall was 10 feet high, and he had no hope of scaling it, so he ran quickly into the house, passed out by the hall door into the street, and towards the lane as quickly as he could. Before he has gone many yards, he sees a man running from the lane, with his clothes in great disorder. And this man, at the sight of Mr. Batchel, darts across the road, runs along in the shadow of the opposite wall, and attempts to escape. Now, this man is well known to Mr. Batchel. It's Stephen Med, a respectable and sensible man, by occupation a shunter. And Mr. Batchel at once calls out to ask what happened. Stephen, however, makes no reply, but he continues to run along the shadow of the wall, whereupon Mr. Batchel crosses over and intercepts him, and again asks him what is amiss. Stephen answers wildly and breathlessly, "I'm not going to stop here. Let me go on, Mr. Batchel." Well, as Mr. Batchel lays his hand upon the man's arm and draws him into the light of the moon, it is seen that his face is streaming with blood from a wound near his eye. Now, Stephen is somewhat calmed by the familiar voice of his vicar, and he's about to speak when another scream is heard from the lane. And this time it's that of a boy or a woman, perhaps, and no sooner does Stephen hear that than he frees himself violently from Mr. Batchel and makes away towards his home. Well, with no less speed does Mr. Batchel make for the lane, and he finds about halfway down a boy lying on the ground, wounded and terrified. I mean, at first the boy clings to the ground, but he too is soon reassured by Mr. Batchel's voice, and he allows himself to be lifted to his feet. His wound is also in the face, and Mr. Batchel takes the boy into his house, bathes and plasters his injury, and he soon restores him to something like calm. He is what is termed a call boy, employed by the railway company to awaken drivers at all hours and give them their instructions. Now, Mr. Batchel is naturally impatient to question the boy about his assailant, who is presumably also the assailant of Stephen Med. At the first available moment, therefore, he asks the boy, "Who did this?" And the answer came, without any hesitation, "Nobody, sir. There was nobody there. All of a sudden, somebody hit me with an iron thing." And then Mr. Batchel asked, "Well, did you see Stephen Med?" The boy replied that he had seen Mr. Med a good bit in front, with nobody near him, and that all of a sudden, somebody knocked him down. Well, Mr. Batchel was becoming greatly puzzled. Further questioning seemed useless. He saw the boy to his home, left him at the door, and returned to bed, but not to sleep. Oh, he could not now cease from thinking, and he could think of nothing but assaults from invisible hands. The morning seemed long in coming, but come it did at last. Mr. Batchel was up betimes and made a very poor breakfast. Dallying with the morning papers rather than reading them, his eye was arrested by a headline, "Mysterious Assaults in Elmham." Now, he felt that he had mysteries of his own to occupy him, and he was in no mood to be interested in more assaults. But he had some knowledge of Elmham, a small town some 10 miles distant from Stoneground, and he read the brief paragraph, which contained no more than the substance of a telegram. It said, however, that 3 persons had been victims of unaccountable assaults. 2 of them had escaped with slight injuries, but the third, a young woman, was dangerously wounded, although still conscious. She declared that she'd been quite alone in her house and had been suddenly struck with great violence by what felt like a piece of iron, and that she was sure she would have bled to death but for a neighbour who heard her cries. The neighbour had at once looked out and seen nobody, but had bravely gone to her friend's assistance. Well, Mr. Batchel laid down his newspaper, considerably impressed, as was natural, by the resemblance of these tragedies to what he had witnessed himself the night before. I mean, he was in no condition to do his usual work now, and so his mind reverted to the conversation at the dinner party and the trifle of antiquarian research that it had suggested. I mean, such an occupation had served him often when he was indisposed from serious work. He would therefore get the registers, he decided, and collect what entries there might be of irregular burial. He found only one such entry, but that one was plenty enough. A note dated All Hallows 1702 to this effect: "This day did a vagrant from Elmham beat cruelly to death 2 poor men who had refused him alms, and upon a hue and cry being raised, took his own life. He was buried in one parson's close, with a stake through his body, and his arms confined in chains and stoutly covered in." Well, no further news came from Elmham. I mean, either the effort had been exhausted or its purpose achieved. But what could possibly have led that young lady, a stranger to Mr. Batchel and to his garden, to hit upon so appropriate a topic of dinner party conversation? Well, Mr. Batchel simply could not answer the question, as he put it to himself again and again during the day. He only knew that she had given him a warning, by which, to his shame and regret, he had been too obtuse to profit.